I think so many people are watching women's basketball right now.
Yeah.
It all started from the national championship game, and I've been dealing with this for 2 years now. And understanding, negative things have probably been said about me, but honestly, I'll take that because look where women's basketball is. People are talking about women's basketball, but you never would think that we'd be talking about women's basketball. People are pulling up to games. We got celebrities coming to games, sold out arenas, just because of one single game.
Brittney Griner just watched Angel Reese walk through the Atlanta Dream's door. And within days, Griner packed her bags and left. Not to a contender, not to a playoff team, but to the Connecticut Sun, which is one of the worst teams in the league. Think about that for a second. A Hall of Fame level center chose the worst team in the WNBA over sharing a locker room with one person. Before she left, Griner reportedly had a few choice words for Ree that absolutely nobody in the league is forgetting anytime soon. The reason she gave for leaving tells you everything you need to know about what Reese's locker rooms actually look like from the inside. A stark contrast from the Caitlin Clark and Indiana Fever locker room. Stay with me because this story gets wild fast. Do you think the Atlanta Dream will fire Angel Reese this season? Let me know in the comments below. What does a player have to do to make her own teammates publicly celebrate the day she gets traded away? Because that is exactly what happened when the Chicago Sky finally moved Angel Reese to the Atlanta Dream. And the reaction from inside that locker room was not subtle at all. Let's talk about how this all started. Because when Reese came to Chicago, the Sky genuinely believed they were getting something special. She came in with massive hype out of LSU. And the idea was that her rebounding would give the team a physical foundation to build around during a rebuild. She pulled down boards at a rate that filled the stat sheet and earned her all-star selections in both her rookie and sophomore seasons. On paper, that looks like a franchise cornerstone. Off paper, it was a completely different story. Chicago finished 13 wins and 34 losses in one season, and then 10 wins and 34 losses in next. So, the team did not just miss the playoffs. They got progressively worse every single year. Ree was the centerpiece of the roster. 2 seasons, 2 bottom finishes, a combined record of 23 wins and 61 losses, and a big chunk of those rebounds everyone kept talking about. A lot of them came right back to her off her own missed shots. Reese missed layups at a rate that is genuinely hard to explain for a player at her level. So, the rebound totals looked dominant while the shooting efficiency told a completely different story. You cannot rebound your way to wins if you are the reason the ball is coming off the rim in the first place. But the losing is almost secondary to what was happening inside the building. Reese's relationship with teammates broke down fast, and it did not stay quiet. When veteran Courtney Vanderloot got hurt, Ree publicly called her old and washed up, which is not something a professional locker room just moves past, no matter how many boards you are grabbing. Vanderloot had been in this league for years. She earned her respect the hard way, and Reese said that publicly. Players remember that kind of thing. Camila Cardoso, who was supposed to be Reese's front court partner, walked out on her during practice. When your own running mate cannot get through a practice without leaving, that tells you something real about the daily atmosphere in that gym. And when losses piled up in post-game interviews, Ree had a habit of deflecting blame toward teammates in ways that players noticed and that nobody forgot. It got bad enough that the Sky actually suspended her for conduct detrimental to the team, which is one of the more dramatic moves a franchise can make. Suspending your own star is not a small step. Once she was gone, people inside the organization did not hold back. A source told Yahoo Sports directly that there is no love lost and that everyone with the Sky is very happy that she is gone. Another source put it even more plainly, saying teammates were getting sick of her and that the trade was very much needed for the health of the organization moving forward. That is not one disgruntled player venting. That is a locker room delivering a verdict. So, the Sky did not trade Reese because the roster needed a shakeup or because they found a better fit somewhere. They traded her because 2 straight years of public teammate bashing, a suspension, and a practice walkout had made the environment unworkable, and the front office decided enough was enough. The production was not worth the damage anymore. And now Atlanta has her with 2 first-round picks already out the door to make it happen. And one very specific veteran on that roster watched the trade come through and immediately started making other plans. 2 first-round picks and a second-round swap. That is what Atlanta paid for a player whose previous franchise had just suspended her and then celebrated the day she left. Let that sit for a second. To understand why that price feels so off, you have to picture what the dream actually looked like going into this. Atlanta finished the 2025 regular season 30-14, which was a franchise record good enough for a top 4 seed. And they had Brittney Griner anchoring the front court alongside Brianna Jones, Alicia Gray, and Ryan Howard. This was not a desperate team scrambling for any name they could get. They were genuinely competing, genuinely in the conversation, and built around a core that already worked together. And then the playoffs happened. That same 30-14 team walked into a first-round series against the Indiana Fever without Caitlin Clark and got bounced. And the part that stings is that the Fever were banged up going into that series, missing key players, operating at something less than full strength. A franchise record regular season ended with a first-round exit against a hobbled opponent. And instead of asking hard questions about execution and competitive mentality, the Dream's front office looked at that result and decided the answer was Angel Reese. That's a specific kind of logic. It requires you to watch 2 straight years of Chicago going backwards with Reese as the centerpiece and conclude that the problem was just the city. It requires you to look at a team that lost because of execution issues and decide what they were missing was a player who averages a lot of rebounds on her own missed shots. And it requires you to ignore a suspension, multiple public incidents with teammates, and a locker room that reportedly exhaled the moment she left. What Atlanta is actually doing here is running back essentially the same roster that lost to a shorthanded Fever team, pulling out Griner, dropping Reese in, and calling an upgrade. Dream fans on social media have not been quiet about this, and the reaction has ranged from confused to flat-out angry, with the most common complaint being exactly what you would expect, that the team swapped a proven veteran for someone whose teams kept losing while her rebound totals kept climbing. Griner's 2025 numbers with Atlanta were down, averaging 9.8 points and 5.2 rebounds, often coming off the bench as Coach Carl Smamesco's system did not fit her style particularly well. So, it is not like she was dropping 20 and 10 every night, but she is a 2-time WNBA champion. A player whose career resume earns immediate respect in any locker room she walks into. And that kind of presence does not show up in a box score. Veterans with rings change how a team practices, how a team handles pressure, and how younger players understand what it takes to actually win. You do not replace that with counting stats. Those 2 first-round picks Atlanta surrendered could have gone toward upgrading the roster around the core they already had, toward building depth, toward targeting a player who actually moves them past Indiana in a playoff series. Instead, those picks are gone, and what Atlanta got back is a player whose previous team's record went 13-34, then 10-34 across 2 seasons built around making her work. The math on this trade is just rough no matter how you run it. Future assets out the door, a veteran anchor gone, and a locker room that was functioning now attached to a player with a documented history of blowing up locker rooms. And the very first person to respond to that trade was not a fan on Twitter or an analyst on a podcast. It was Brittney Griner herself, and she did not need a press conference to make her feelings clear. When the retrade landed, Griner was still under contract with Atlanta, still healthy, still a player that any team with playoff ambitions would want around. Nobody forced her hand. Whatever she did next was completely her call. And what she did was call Angel Reese a toxic loser. Not in a vague, carefully worded statement designed to protect her reputation. Reports coming out right after the trade described Griner's reaction to Reese joining the Dream as direct and damning, with Griner making clear she believed Reese would not change her behavior just because the city on her jersey changed. The dysfunction that followed Reese through 2 seasons in Chicago was not going to stay in Chicago. Griner apparently looked at that situation and decided she had seen enough of this story already to know exactly how it ends. So 5 days after Atlanta announced the retrade, Griner signed with the Connecticut Sun. Not the Las Vegas Aces, not the Minnesota Lynx, not any of the teams sitting near the top of the league with real championship windows open right now. Gurrier chosen the Connecticut Sun, a team that finished tied for the worst record in the league. You choose the Sun because you need to get as far from Atlanta as your options allow. Picture this. A player who came back to professional basketball after everything that happened to her, who has 2 championship rings and a Hall of Fame career behind her, looked at the Atlanta Dream locker room and decided that was the harder environment. Not a rematch. With a team that beat them in the playoffs, not a tough schedule, not a new coaching system to learn. Angel Reese in the same building. That was what Gurrier wanted no part of. Gurrier had been paying attention. Reese publicly called Courtney Vanderloot old and washed up. 2 years of post-game interviews saw Reese redirect blame toward teammates. There was a suspension from her own franchise. Camila Cardoso walked out of practice. Sources inside Chicago described the locker room as genuinely miserable. None of that happens quietly in a league this small, where everyone knows everyone. Veterans talk. Gurrier knew exactly what the daily environment in Chicago looked like. And when that environment announced it was relocating to Atlanta, Gurrier relocated first. The veteran versus newcomer tension in the WNBA is not new. Rookies come in with big reputations and sometimes rub veterans the wrong way. Usually that friction stays behind closed doors and gets worked out over a season or two. But Gurrier did not quietly ask for a trade or put out a nothing-to-see-here statement about wanting a new challenge. She signed with a bottom-tier team within 5 days of Reese's arrival, and she let the timeline speak. That is not subtle. That is a veteran with 2 rings telling you exactly what she thinks without needing a single microphone. Reese's public brand runs on the idea that she is unbothered, that criticism bounces off, that she is too confident to care what anyone thinks. Post all the unbothered content you want on social media, and none of it changes the fact that a Hall of Fame player looked at a roster built around you and chose the worst team in the league instead. That is not a narrative you spin away. That is a concrete choice by a real person with real options who decided your locker room was not worth it. Atlanta gave up 2 first-round picks, lost their veteran anchor 5 days after the trade, and the season had not even started yet. For 2 years, every conversation about the Chicago Sky included some version of the same line. Nobody wants to play there. Free agents weren't calling. Veterans weren't interested. And the franchise looked like a place players ended up rather than a place they chose. That narrative collapsed so fast after the retrade that it's almost hard to track. Let's talk about what Chicago actually did once Reese was gone, because the front office moved fast. They signed Skylar Diggins-Smith to a 2-year deal. And if you know anything about Diggins-Smith, you know she doesn't go somewhere to lose quietly. 7-time All-Star, one of the most competitive point guards in the league, and known for running a practice environment where accountability isn't optional. Bringing her in after 2 years of Reese's drama is a very deliberate message about the direction this franchise wants to go. They also locked up Azora Stevens on a 3-year deal worth a reported $1 million per season, a floor-stretching big who actually spaces the floor and opens driving lanes. And then they traded for Rickea Jackson from the Los Angeles Sparks, giving up Ariel Atkins and a 2028 first-round pick swap to get a 6 feet 2 inches forward who averaged 14.7 points last season and can create her own shot. CBS Sports graded that trade an A- for Chicago. Not a good trade, not a solid trade, an A-. Every single one of these players either earned all-star selections, all defensive honors, or came in specifically because of what they add to a winning culture. And they all committed to Chicago within weeks of Reese leaving. That's not a coincidence, and everyone watching the league knows it. But that's not all. The Sky also resigned Courtney Vanderloot, which, if you remember, is the exact veteran Reese publicly called old and washed up after Vanderloot got hurt. Chicago brought her back. The franchise looked at the veteran. Reese tried to bury with a post-game quote and decided she still belonged there. That move landed quietly, but it communicated something very clearly about whose version of the Sky the front office believed in. Now, are you ready for the part where Reese fans completely lost it? The Sky assigned Reese's number 5 jersey to Ricky A. Jackson, and it happened fast with no ceremony, no retirement discussion, no acknowledgement that the number had any history worth pausing over. Jackson wore number 5 in high school and college, so the Sky just handed it to her and moved on. Ree fans flooded Chicago social media demanding the number be retired, which would be a reasonable request for a player who won a championship with the franchise or spent a decade building something real there. But Reese got suspended and traded after 2 losing seasons. Retiring that number would be retiring a combined record of 23 and 61 in a locker room that players reportedly could not wait to escape. The jersey situation almost perfectly captures what Chicago decided about those 2 years. No pause, no tribute, just a new player wearing the number like the previous chapter already closed. Because as far as the front office is concerned, it did. Fans online pointed out the irony. Chicago started doing exactly what Angel Reese had begged them to do the moment she left. Before the trade, Reese publicly pushed for the franchise to bring in better players around her. The Sky did bring in better players, but only after she was gone. Skylar Diggins-Smith did not sign here when Reese was running the locker room. Ricky Jackson did not come when the environment was what it was. Stevens did not commit to a team in that kind of chaos. Players were watching Chicago from a distance, waiting, and the moment the locker room changed, they picked up the phone. Atlanta's front office looked at a first-round playoff exit, and they decided the problem was rebounding. That is the argument behind the trade, that Reese's interior presence would push a team that already finished 30-14 to get past the first round. For that argument to work, you would have to believe that rebounding was the specific thing holding the dream back. That view ignores basically everything that actually happened in that playoff series. Consider what Atlanta had before the trade. Alicia Gray was a scoring wing who can create off the dribble. Ryan Howard was developing into one of the better two-way guards in the league. They had real depth across the roster. And Brittney Griner was an experienced anchor who had won championships and knew how to handle playoff pressure. That is not a team that lost because they could not rebound. That is a team with a legitimate front court that still got bounced in the first round by an Indiana Fever squad that was not even fully healthy going into the series. Caitlin Clark and the Fever were banged up, missing contributors, including Caitlin herself, operating shorthanded, and they still sent Atlanta home. That points to a competitive mentality issue, an execution issue, not something you fix just by adding someone who grabbed a lot of boards. Atlanta is now running back essentially the same roster that lost to a shorthanded Fever team with Reese replacing Griner. And the honest version of that swap is pretty uncomfortable too. Look at Griner won 2 championships. Reese has never played in a playoff game. Gurrier's 2025 numbers with Atlanta were down, sure, but she brought the kind of locker room credibility and championship experience that younger players actually learn from. Reese brings a documented suspension, 2 consecutive last-place finishes, and a trail of burned relationships with former teammates who reportedly celebrated when she left. Reese alongside Gray and Howard could produce some interesting combinations on paper, but Atlanta's problem against Indiana wasn't about front court combinations. It was about closing out a series against a team that wasn't at full strength. And nothing about Reese's track record suggests she makes a team better at that specific thing. Picture this. You lose a playoff series you should have won. And your response is to import the player whose previous teams went 23-61 across 2 seasons. That's the move Atlanta made. Dream fans who were already frustrated by that first-round exit are watching all of this play out in real time, and the loudest complaints are pretty consistent. Atlanta didn't address what actually broke them in the playoffs. They just added a player who cost 2 first-round picks and immediately drove away a Hall of Fame veteran before training camp even opened. Those picks are gone. Gurrier's gone. And the team that beat Atlanta is only getting healthier. Caitlin Clark enters her 3rd season with a full off-season of preparation. The Fever's injured players are coming back, and Indiana is going to be harder to beat in 2026 than they were when they eliminated Atlanta while playing shorthanded. Griner didn't leave Atlanta because she feared competition. She left because she'd watched this exact movie play out in Chicago for 2 straight years, and she wasn't sitting through it again in a city she'd just helped build into a contender. Chicago rebuilt their entire roster in one off-season. Atlanta lost a Hall of Fame player before training camp opened, and Reese is already on her second team before turning 24, carrying the same reputation that got her suspended and traded in the first place. None of that changes until the behavior does. Do you think the Atlanta Dream will fire Angel Reese this season? Let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss out. Click the video on the screen, and we will see you in the next one.